So, hi everybody. It's Linda Gould from Democrats Abroad Japan, and I'm here today with David Litt.
If Kavanaugh is appointed, you will have at least several Bush appointees, and this would be the second Trump appointee, who are appointed by presidents who did not win a majority of the popular vote.
Right.
And so, if we have a system where a minority party is blocking Obama's last Supreme Court nominee, and then appointing its own, and you combine this with an electoral college that isn't representative, plus a Senate that's not representative, plus very, very effective gerrymandering in 2010, as following the 2010 census, so that the House of Representatives also the deck is stacked, where unless you have a 5 or 6% difference in the popular vote, you won't have enough votes to elect a majority of Democrats in the House of Representatives. Then you run into a real problem where people are going to feel, rightly so, as if they're not, as if the system is no longer representative. And so the question is, how do we solve that before it gets worse?
Yes, but that takes more than 20 minutes for us to solve that. Although my husband and I solve it every morning over coffee. Yeah, I mean that's very well summarized. That's where we are today, and that's, I think, what makes a lot of I'm tempted to say Democrats, but I actually don't even think that it's limited to Democrats. I think that's what makes so many people, independent, Democrats, middle class, poor, black, white, just feel so frustrated because this is not the first time that they're feeling as if their government doesn't work for them. And now the idea that, someone like Kavanaugh can be nominated and confirmed under, as you rightly said, a president who did not win the popular vote and who is under a cloud of suspicion of, I would term it treason, but I know that that's a very strong term. I mean, it's just, and then the idea that someone like Kavanaugh would, make decisions about our lives for the next 30 years is just really defeating. And I guess that's the last thing that I'd like to talk to you about is, as a law professor, as someone who's familiar with the Supreme Court and the justice system at large, what can we do, if anything, or to change the Supreme Court, or to stop Kavanaugh, or to short of a constitutional amendment, because that's not going to happen. What can we do to get people motivated that the government does work for them, and that this Supreme Court justice should be a voting issue? Because if we can stop him, then what? Yeah. That's a lot to put on your shoulders.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if to stop more very conservative nominees from being nominated and getting on the Supreme Court, the answer is win the presidency and take control of the Senate, and not in that order. Take the Senate first, and if the Democrats held a majority in the Senate, then they would be able to say, President Trump, you have an opening on the court. We will be happy to consider your nominee in tandem with Merrick Garland. I think that's something that Chuck Schumer offered, and the offer was declined. And there was nothing he could do about it because it only takes 51 votes, including the vice president, to move a Supreme Court nomination through, and that is based on rule changes that Harry Reid made.
Right.
But because Obama's nominees were being held up, I would say aren't necessarily a bad thing to actually reduce. One of the problems with the Senate is that it's unrepresentative, and if you need 60 votes, the Democrats can have a 60% of the popular vote, and they'll never get to 60 votes in the Senate. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to reduce some of those abilities of individual senators to block things. But in this case, it works against the Democrats. So the most important thing is to win elections, to motivate people to actually to not get frustrated and not be defeated by this entire situation. I think people are incredibly motivated right now to participate, to vote, to contribute, and so I don't think. I mean, I think again, if we look at what's typically happened in midterm elections, the party that's out of power does pick up a lot of seats, and they do that because they are motivated. And I think at this point, the Million Women March, the incredible slates of new candidates that are running for state legislatures, for the House of Representatives, the success that the Democrats have had in special elections. I think the sort of educated inside view is certainly that the Democrats are ready to pick up the House of Representatives and have a shot at the Senate.
I thought it was the other way around. Actually,
well, the problem is that the Senate, if you look at they're playing defense in a number of places where there are vulnerable Democrats, and there are not very many Republicans up. And there are very few vulnerable Republicans up. So it's hard for the Democrats to pick up in the Senate, whereas in the House, all 435 seats are up, and the Democrats need, 22 seats, 23 seats, something like that, and there are predictions that they could pick up 50 if things go well. Of course, that all depends on people actually voting. It depends on there not being any October surprise involving our president or the state of the world.
Specifically about Brett Kavanaugh, the idea that he has been in support of a unitary executive is really scary to me. And when I saw the candidates and I saw that, I'm like, okay, he's the one who's going to get the nomination, not even knowing anything else about anybody else. And I wonder if that is me really just being conspiratorial and being really scared about something, or if that really is a concern to other people in the law field.
Yeah, I mean, I think Kavanaugh's view is very mainstream, particularly for conservatives. But so I don't think there's anything extraordinary about support for a unitary executive. I think the unusual thing, first of all, the question really is, we've never had a president like this before. And we have many, many examples of the Defense Department, the State Department, some other part of the government, a secretary in the cabinet, coming out with some official government statement, and immediately the president tweeting the opposite. And this question of what is the government policy? And the unitary executive theory would be, well, it's what the president says it is. But I think...
But even that changes from day to day.
But even that changes when that is nonsensical, or it's contradictory, or it changes from day to day. You can't take it seriously. And I think many people are, including conservative unitary executive scholars, are struggling with this and saying, how do you deal with this situation where... the president says one thing, and then the Justice Department says the opposite. At the same day, or the president's Justice Department says something, and the president immediately undercuts it with some conspiracy theory. We don't really have a good structure to deal with it. The idea of the unitary executive, I think, was mostly an attack on the regulatory state, where you have some commission and they do something, and there's no way for political will to basically control what they do. and saying we need a unitary executive. We can't have sort of rogue administrators going off and doing things on their own. And so that's why the Constitution doesn't give authority to rogue administrators. It says the president runs the executive branch, and so as a constitutional theory, it's again not that unusual, and you can see many things that went on in the sort of 1960s and 70s with an expansion of the government, where they're sort of negative examples, and the unitary executive revival of the unitary executive was seen as a way to solve real problems with it.
Can you think of an example about that?
The one that comes to mind is a little bit different because it deals with federalism, for example, where the federal government would put all these requirements on the states, but wouldn't give them the money to implement the requirements, and so was using its ability to pass laws to basically make the states sort of administrative branches of the federal government, for example. You could see things like that where scholars said, wait a minute, that's not the way the Constitution is supposed to work in a federal system. Maybe that's the way it should have been written, but that isn't the way it was written.
So as an example, like, do you mean, because I'm just trying to understand this, because like I said, the idea of a unitary executive is really scary to me, but to me, I interpreted it as being more like the president gets to do what he wants, and as weighting the executive branch more than the other two branches. So I wonder if what you mean is, like, if you have the head of the EPA, because they hate the EPA, who's making a regulation about arsenic in the water, acceptable levels of arsenic, and that, because that gets worked into the rules of the agency that then goes out to the states, if a state doesn't want to do that, or if the next president doesn't want those rules there, are you saying that that's the situation where a president could just say, no, we're going to get rid of these rules?
I think if the EPA comes up with some rules, they're usually doing that pursuant to a statute, which has given them authority and given them guidelines as to what they're supposed to be regulating and what the purposes of the statute are, and has bounded their discretion. Okay. And so there are plenty of limits on the ability of, and we've seen it already, where every time the Trump administration tears up an Obama EPA rule, there's immediately litigation filed, and it will be tied up in the courts. The ones that have actually gone into effect, when they get torn up without proper process and a deliberative decision making, there's a perfectly good chance that will be struck down by the courts. I think a good example might be if you had supposing you had some sort of overlapping regulation where the Secretary of Energy had some authority and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission had some authority, and they came up with different rules. Judge Kavanaugh would say that because the Federal Energy Regulatory Authority is an independent commission with 5 members, and always going to be 2 of them from the minority party, and 3 from the president's party typically, and they're not under direct control, whereas the Department of Energy is under direct control of the president. If there's really an overlap and a conflict, then maybe we should give priority to what the Secretary of Energy is saying, because that has the backing of the political branch directly, and the president can fire the Secretary of Energy.
What about the part that Kavanaugh said regarding the executive, that while in office he cannot be indicted?
I think that, again, if what he said is that the president could not be indicted or tried or convicted for a crime while in office. Again, that has never been tested in the United States, but it's also consistent with the view of the Justice Department for the last several presidents, I think going back to at least the Clinton administration. And while it has never been tested, it's probably the majority view of constitutional scholars. So it's not an extreme view. It may be a view that's attractive to President Trump, but it also may be a view that if depending on the type of misconduct, when the court is faced with an actual example of something, they may change their view. They may come up with a view. I mean, I think with this president, if the Congress refuses, first of all, the reason that you don't want to allow a president to be indicted and prosecuted is for a crime while in office is obviously that and will prevent the president from conducting the office. If you're a criminal defendant, you may be imprisoned, and you're subject to restrictions that aren't going to allow you to perform the office of president. Clinton, argued that some of the civil litigation, the Paula Jones case, should be stayed while he was in office. Because for exactly that reason, and the court said no, it's only a civil case. It's not going to take that much of your time. It's not, and the case could go forward. And so, hence the Trump University case is going forward. There civil litigation. He settled he settled the lawsuits with Trump University, but they would have gone forward while he was president. The Trump Foundation tax fraud cases are going forward, and if to the extent that it's just a civil claim, and involves the directors and President Trump as one of the past directors of the Trump Foundation, those arguably should go forward. But the idea is that if the president has committed serious crimes, that the remedy is impeachment. The problem we have is, of course, that the Congress is not exercising, doesn't look like it would be willing to impeach at this point. But that could change. Again, it could change after the election, or it could change after additional facts are known. With this president, I think there's every likelihood that if he commits crimes, that after the end of his term in office, he would be prosecuted for those crimes.
Okay, you've talked me down a little bit. Thank you. Because I think it was really interesting, and I think the things that we talked about are relevant to today and will be interesting to other people. Well, thank you so much, David. I really appreciate your talking to us or talking to me, and I'll share this with members of Democrats Abroad Japan, and I look forward to seeing you in September for a speech that you'll give on September 11th.
Okay. Delighted. Thank you very much.